So in today's lecture, we're going to briefly discuss smooth muscle. We're not going to talk very much about cardiac muscle because that is something that you're going to get kind of in depth in Bio 50B. And so we are just going to talk about smooth muscle today. So smooth muscle is going to be found in the walls of most of the hollow organs. So this is going to include the respiratory system, digestive, urinary, reproductive, circulatory. It's not going to be found in the very smallest of the blood vessels, and it also is not going to be found in the heart. So the heart is going to have cardiac muscle, not smooth muscle. So again, you'll hear all about cardiac muscle when you get to 50B. Most of the smooth muscle is going to be organized into these sheets of tightly packed fibers, and most muscles are going to tend to have two kind of different layers of these fibers. So I wanted to be on this slide so that I can kind of show you what I'm going to talk about. So this is going to describe how smooth muscle is going to have two layers, and the two layers are actually going to be going at right angles to each other. So most organs are going to have these two layers of sheets, and the fibers are going to be oriented at this right angle. So one of the layers is going to be called the longitudinal layer. And so I want you to think of my arm as being an organ, kind of our tube, and the longitudinal will be the fibers that are going to be going this direction, kind of down the parallel to the long axis of the organ. And so when these contract, they're going to actually shorten the distance of the organ. So I can't do that with my arm because it has bones in it, but you can imagine this would be shortening. Now, the second layer of muscle is going to actually be circular. So it's going to go around the circumference. So instead of running a lot this way, it's going to actually run around the circle. So you can imagine kind of muscles that are going to be in the circular direction around the circumference of the organ. When those are going to constrict, think about it as a tube. When they constrict, you're going to have a tightening of the tube. So it's going to constrict the tube, which is going to cause the lumen of the organ, or kind of the hole in the organ, to get smaller. Now, when you have kind of all of this together, you have alternating of the contractions of both the longitudinal muscles and the circular muscles. Okay, and so when you have those, they will then be able to move substances through the different organs. So now we're going to talk about some differences between smooth and skeletal muscle fibers. We've talked a lot about skeletal muscle, and hopefully you are very familiar with the structure of the skeletal muscle. But let's talk a little bit more about smooth muscle. So smooth muscle are going to tend to have this spindle-shaped fiber, okay? And they're going to be thin and short compared to skeletal muscle fibers, which are very long. Okay, skeletal muscle fibers are the longest muscle fibers that we have in our bodies. There also is only going to be one centrally located nucleus inside of a smooth muscle cell, and there are going to be no striations. So you will not see this regular pattern of the thin and thick filaments, and so you will not see any of those striations in the smooth muscle. There are not going to be as many connective tissue sheaths as we have in skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle, we have three different layers of those connective tissues. We're only going to actually have one layer of connective tissue, and that's going to be the endomysium. Okay, so that's the only one that you will find in smooth muscle. So that's a pretty big difference between skeletal and smooth. So now we're going to talk about the actual nerve fibers that are going to innervate the smooth muscle. And they're going to be quite different from what we see in skeletal muscle. So in smooth muscle, we have these things called varicosities, which are going to be these swellings of the nerve fiber, okay? And this is going to be kind of how you have interaction with the smooth muscle and the nerve, which is very different from what we saw in skeletal muscle fibers, which had these neuromuscular junctions. Okay, so these varicosities are going to store and release the neurotransmitters into kind of these large, wide synaptic clefts that are going to be referred to as diffuse junction. Okay, so again, very different anatomy when we talk about kind of how we have this innervation taking place. Now, these are going to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So remember, when we're talking about smooth muscle, we are talking about something that is not consciously controlled, so unlike skeletal muscle, where usually skeletal muscle is going to be consciously regulated. So now we're going to look at kind of now in the smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle is going to have a much less elaborate sarcoplasmic reticulum. There are no T-tubules. There's not kind of these terminal cisterns that we have in the skeletal muscle. Okay, so the sarcoplasmic reticulum is much less developed than in the skeletal muscle. Okay, we do have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that is where calcium is going to be stored, but it is going to be quite different. Much of the calcium that is going to be used for contractions actually is going to come from outside of the cell. So yes, there is calcium inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it will release calcium, but there also are going to be calcium that's going to enter kind of via these other voltage-gated calcium channels from the extracellular fluid. The sarcolemma is also going to have these pouch-like infoldings called caveolae, and these are going to be where those voltage-gated calcium channels are going to be. Okay. There are going to be numerous calcium channels along the sarcolemma, and we are going to have kind of influx of calcium through those ion channels. Now, smooth muscle fibers are going to be connected to each other via gap junctions. So unlike skeletal muscle, which the skeletal muscle is kind of its own unit and it gets innervation by kind of a motor neuron, you're going to actually have all smooth muscle and area are going to be electrically coupled and connected to each other. So you're going to have flow of kind of these, the stimulation for the contraction moving through all the smooth muscle fibers. Okay, so these allow depolarization to spread from cell to cell. Okay, so this is going to allow kind of these muscles to move kind of in concert with each other. There are going to be no striations and no sarcomeres in the actual smooth muscle, and you will not really see kind of much of this overlapping thick and thin filament in the same way that we see in skeletal muscle. So smooth muscle is going to have fewer thick filaments, okay? And the myosin heads are actually going to go along the entire length of the actual thick filament. The ratio of the thick to thin filaments is going to be much lower than we see in skeletal muscle. So in skeletal muscle, we have kind of 1 thick filament to 2 thin filaments. And in the smooth muscle, we're going to have a 1 to 13 ratio. So much different kind of at the myofilament level. The thick filaments are going to have heads that go along the entire axis, again, of the thick filament. And this is going to make smooth muscle very strong, almost, generally as powerful as skeletal muscle is. Okay, there's going to be no troponin complex that we see in our skeletal muscle. There is going to be tropomyosin, but there is no troponin. Okay, so it's going to be kind of a different type of regulation taking place. There is going to be a protein called calmodulin that's going to bind to calcium. Okay, so that's going to be a slightly different mechanism for how the contraction is going to take place. And we're not actually going to talk about the contraction of smooth muscle, but we just kind of want to look at the actual anatomy of the smooth muscle to see how they're different. Now, the thick and thin filaments are going to be arranged diagonally, and the myofilaments are going to be arranged kind of spiraling around the smooth muscle cell. And this is going to make it look like a corkscrew when it actually contracts. Now, we have these other filaments that are going to be called intermediate filaments, or dense body, kind of form this dense body network. They actually don't contract, and it kind of reminds me as if you have this smooth muscle that then has a fishnet stocking on the outside. Okay, so parts of the muscle can kind of extrude out of the fishnet stocking or these intermediate filaments, but it's basically going to keep everything in sort of one shape and not allow it to change shape too much. And so these intermediate filaments will actually resist the tension. We also have these dense bodies, which are going to be proteins that anchor the filaments to the sarcolemma. And they're going to be very similar to what we see in the Z-disc of skeletal muscle. So kind of making sure that things don't move too far away and they're in the right place so that they can have an actual contraction take place. Okay, when there is contraction, areas of the sarcolemma will actually dense, kind of bulge outward of this area of the lattice-like arrangement of the intermediate filament. This again is kind of what I was explaining, where that we have a fishnet stocking kind of around the smooth muscle, and part of the muscle can kind of bulge out of it. So it makes the muscle cell look puffy and kind of very different than what we see in our skeletal muscle fibers. So these last 3 or 4 slides are all going to be about comparison between the cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle. So you need to know the basics about all 3. You need to know very in-depth about skeletal muscle because we talked about it the most. And then you want to know a little bit more about smooth muscle fibers because we've also discussed that. Okay, but we really did not go much into cardiac muscle. That's something that you're going to get later. But you do need to know the basics, that where it's found. It has these intercalated discs and some of the other things that we've discussed over the past couple lectures. If we look at the different types of connective tissues, make sure for the skeletal muscles you know all 3 different layers and you know where each of those connective tissues is found. We really didn't talk anything about the endomysium that's attached to the cardiac muscle, but we did mention that endomysium is the only type of connective tissue for the smooth muscle. We know a lot about T-tubules, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and everything to do with kind of the skeletal muscle structure. We did not talk at all about cardiac sarcomere arrangements or anything like that, so don't worry about that. When we look at kind of the presence of gap junctions or how elaborate the sarcoplasmic reticulum are, we know that in skeletal muscle it is quite kind of elaborate. We didn't really talk much about the cardiac or the smooth muscle, other than the smooth muscle has a much less elaborate sarcoplasmic reticulum. We did mention that there are no gap junctions in skeletal muscle. There are in cardiac muscles, and these are at the intercalated discs. Intercalated discs are very important. You must know these about cardiac cells because this is going to kind of be one of the defining characteristics that you can use to distinguish which muscle histology is going to be the cardiac one. And there are going to be gap junctions in the smooth muscle, so we talked about that. I would know just a little bit about the innervation of the smooth muscle, but you need to know a lot about how we have a motor neuron coming in and causing muscle contraction. So make sure that you are good with the neuromuscular junction. And when we look at kind of the regulation of contraction, you do need to be aware of all 3 of these. So we have voluntary contraction for our skeletal muscle, but both the smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle are going to be involuntary and going to be regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so this last slide is going to show kind of some of the differences in kind of calcium, kind of where it's going to be stored. So again, if we talked about it, we talked about all of this stuff to do with skeletal muscle, so make sure you're really clear on all of this. We didn't talk much about sarcoplasmic reticulum or any of the other parts of this when it comes to the cardiac muscle. We did mention kind of the speed of the different contractions of muscle in lab, and so you're going to have kind of slow contraction in both cardiac and smooth. Smooth is very slow. Cardiac is relatively quick, but it is slower than your fastest contraction in the skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle can be slow to fast depending on what's happening. We also have talked about metabolism for skeletal muscle. We did not talk about that for cardiac or smooth, so don't really worry about that. If we didn't talk about it in any detail, then that will not be on the test.